So this is one of those topics as alternate histories which could either be incredibly long or incredibly short. It really could be. So I have no idea going in. I have a script of things I want to hit, but there are also a lot of options for me to go down and discuss with you, and frankly, sometimes I do wander down them. I do. Because I can on a video. I try and aim for it to be 90 minutes. 70 to 90 minutes, because that's the sweet spot, it seems, for the logarithm. But there's no one holding a gun to my head if I decide to go longer or shorter, depending on what I feel is suiting the presentation. So this was their question. The Royal Navy really likes the X-1 and continues developing them. What's the impact on treaties in World War II? Well, from a very little acorn, a very big question can flow. A very big question can flow. This is actually a topic which I've debated before with students. Because X-1 is potentially a very interesting point of genesis. You see, they try and push a lot of technological development, including a lot of stuff to do with her camshafts, drive thrust arrangement, and how her gearing was arranged. Not just the guns, not just everything else. And if she'd proved successful instead of a reliability maintenance nightmare and a dry dock queen, she could have led to a whole interesting development cycle. And that's the point, really. She was a lot of potentiality, a lot of capability, but she also had limitations. Still, the Royal Navy was suffering a cruiser shortage, and if they'd liked her, and if they'd pushed for it, there are other nations investigating the cruiser submarine topic enough that probably would have got something. And we'll talk about that when we get to the alternate history. As it is, we're going to do a little bit of a précis cruiser history submarines at London Naval Treaty discussion before we get to the Shameless Book Plug, and then we're going to do the alternate history. So you're going to get some of the history, and then, as always, the alternate history after the Shameless Book Plug. So let's start off with X-1 herself. I apologise for my chair, by the way. Every time I try and put something on it, if anyone has any suggestions, stuff which, if the dogs lick it, is safe for them, but which they won't like, so they won't lick, is really, really looked forward to. So far they like everything put here, and some of it they really shouldn't have liked and was not good for them to lick, so yes. I'm never going to not have a squeaky chair with them. Anyway, X-1. Well, it's a cruiser submarine. But the interesting point is she's laid down in November 1921. She's launched in 1923 and completed for service in 1925 and finally commissioned in 1925, which means she has pretty much a 4-year laying down to commissioning construction cycle, and there were ideas for her going around a long time before then. The whole M series of submarines prior to World War I and various other things that have been looked into are all part of the analysis going on. And the idea is simple. It's disturbingly simple. Torpedoes are big, expensive, take up a lot of space. We can't carry enough torpedoes to service all the targets we want to service with torpedoes. So we need something which can service targets which would normally require a torpedo instead of a standard deck gun. Oh, well, we have an option here. We have an option. 4 twin 5.2-inch guns. Rapid firing, designed for close quarters engagement with disturbingly high penetration at that range. These weapons were powerful systems. And they had the advantage that with the number of shells carried, 100 rounds per gun, carrying 400 of these rounds, you could sink a lot of large merchant ships very quickly without using your torpedoes, saving your torpedoes, the important things, for things which can actually kill you, or which are worthy adversaries, like battleships or cruisers. And pretty much the cruiser submarine is exactly what it says on the tin. They would have a surface range of 12,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. 12,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. That's a pretty darn decent range for wandering around. They would be able to raid opponents, take them out in merchant shipping, and then disappear. They could attack light warships and then disappear. If they snuck up on something which is a sloop, or especially World War I near a sloop, it would be massacred so quickly, frankly. It's better off not knowing what happened to it, because of the sheer amount of damage that would be dealt with it so quickly, the cumulative effect. So this is a interesting on-paper design. I would say I treat them the same as modern SSGNs, i.e. the conventional cruise missile, the nuclear powered often, but conventionally armed cruise missile submarines. In that they are a really, really powerful system if you decide to invest in it. They can deliver you all sorts of options if you invest in it. And they potentially offer a great deal number of solutions to various problems if you invest in it. But, like the SSGN, you need to invest to actually build it. And the X-1, unlike the SSGN, didn't have an SSBN program, a ballistic missile submarine program, to leech off, basically. It didn't have another system going on that was already being paid for to make it justifiable. So you're putting all this cost to develop this system, and you're going, well, is it a really good cruiser? No, a surface ship is a better cruiser. Realistically, a surface ship is a better cruiser. Is it a really good submarine? No. Other submarines are better at being submarines. It's a fusion. It can't do either role that greatly. But it still offers some interesting capabilities. It really does. And it offers some interesting potential, especially if you consider the Far East and other areas of British presence. It does provide them with the option of being able to do things when they need to in a not so much deniable manner, but a covert manner. Definitely a covert manner. With that being said, what were their counterparts? Well, the counterparts are actually quite many and varied before 1930, and that's when the London Naval Treaty was, so that's the important point to think about. We have Naval and Nautilus in the United States, armed with 6.1-inch guns and part of the V-boat series. Again, good vessels. Really nice vessels. But also pretty darn big. Nearly 4,000 tons submerged. They had huge power capabilities. They could carry a whole lot of torpedoes and 2 6-inch 53 cal deck guns. The largest guns ever mounted on US submarines. And they're not alone. There are lots of other options. If you're looking for a cruiser submarine, you can go to the Japanese. You can go for the J1 or the Type I1, depending on who you're talking about, or the Junsen Ichigata Sensukian, i.e. the cruiser submarine Type 1. Sometimes known as the Ichigata Sensukian. And they build 4 of those boats. The Japanese build 4 between 1926 and 1929. And they do interesting operations. I-1 herself is actually present in the attack on Pearl Harbor. And she's also a great intelligence find when the US Navy salvaged 200,000 pages of intelligence, codebooks, charts, manuals, and a ship's log from her. It's useful. It's all information. But the thing is, these ships, again, they're armed with 140mm guns, fore and aft, so 5.2 something inches. They have 6 forward torpedo tubes, 2 aft. They could carry 20 torpedoes. There is an advantage to being a submarine this big. You can carry a lot of weapons. You really can. And it's even the Italians, the Ettore Firmosca. Now, the Ettore Firmosca is beautiful. She really is beautiful. But I would point out that she's also the lightest we're talking about here, and a little under 2,100 tons submerged. But she is armed with a 4.7-inch gun, and she is built with plans for doing the cruising role. That's why she has the range she has for the Mediterranean, all the capabilities she does for what she's going to do. And the fact she can do 8 knots submerged is a really useful thing, because you have to remember that 7 knots submerged, you have to be able to go 7 knots or greater to get out the Strait of Gibraltar. So being able to go 8 knots, that's surfeit of speed. That is. So these are the cruiser submarines we're talking about. They're all much of a muchness. You can start to see a category emerging. And realistically, that category does have historical precedence. It does in the London Naval Treaty. Because whilst this is what we remember about the treaty tonnage and all these limitations and all the things, and everyone goes, it's one category of submarines. It isn't. It isn't one category of submarines. Yes, this is the tonnage distribution. Yes, everyone's allowed the same number of submarines in this scenario to do what you want with, which is lovely. But if you read Article 7.1, no submarine, the standard space of which exceeds 2,000 tons or with a gun above 5.1 inch caliber shall be acquired by or constructed by or for any of the high contracting parties. And point 2 immediately adds in, each of the high contracting parties may, however, retain, build, or acquire a maximum number of free submarines, or standard plated not exceeding 2,800 tons. These submarines may carry guns not above 6.1 inch caliber, and alongside this, France may retain one unit already launched of 2,880 tons with guns of caliber which is 8 inches. Now, you might have heard me say, well, hang on, when they're writing these instructions, when they were sort of first designing these in the 1920s, I didn't mention the French vessel earlier. Well, that's because the Surcouf, as interesting as she is, and the fact that she is laid down, ordered in 1926, laid down in 1927, launched in November 1929, but she's not commissioned till 1934. She has a really, really long build. We're talking almost a 10-year period, and it's from ordering to delivery, it's getting very close to 8 years. Very, very close to 8 years. Again, she's an interesting vessel. She is probably the ultimate big gun cruiser, whereby, in contrast, the X-1 is more, what kind of fast, rapid fire can we put down range? Something which is going to make up for our targeting inefficiency with sheer number of shells we can poke at the enemy with. It's also interesting to look at the differences in between, again, because the Americans go for a 6-inch, the Italians go for an actually less than 5-inch, a 4.7-inch. The Japanese go for something which is a 5-inch, but a little bit more, sort of more close to the X-1. It's interesting to see the spectrum, and then you've got the French with the big 8-inch gun. And realistically, the treaty's like this because the Royal Navy, if they could, would have actually treated away submarines. If Britain had got its way, submarines would have got banned by treaty. They would have not been allowed to continue in the world. No one would have been allowed to have them. That was the British dream. It failed. It failed miserably multiple times, but they kept going back to that dream. And the reason it failed was because the other powers wanted submarines. I wasn't sure if they wanted big submarines, but they wanted submarines. So, we've got two questions really we have to answer. One, we thought we once we're through the show's book plug. One, why did the British suddenly want submarines? Why did they want X-1s? And then once we answer that, that'll help us work out the rest. Because when we worked out why do they want submarines and why do they want X-1s, that might be the same answer. In fact, hopefully it will be the same answer. From there we can work out what the logical progression it leads to, and what kind of situation we're going to have facing World War II. The actual events of World War II may vary. You're going to have some very big submarines going around, and that also might affect what other powers are designing and building in response to them. All the fun things. All the fun of the fair. With that being said, though, it's now time for the shameless book plug. Yay! So, shameless book plug, time where I go, thank you for supporting and liking and sharing and all those things to the channel. Thank you for subscribing especially, that really does help the channel grow, and thank you for that. I've been having fun lately with some of the videos that have been set on this channel and recorded, because currently I'm recording this back in September. This comes out the end of October, well, 21st of October. No, not 21st, 23rd of October, I think. 23rd of October, I think. And, yeah, it's been a lot of fun. There's a lot of fun going on. And thank you for that. Thank you for your kindness of supporting and sharing and helping the channel grow. Thank you for everything you do. I do enjoy this. I do enjoy the history. I do enjoy the discussions. I do enjoy the fact that I get to sometimes go, oh, so that on the history side. When you're looking at reading through some of the comments and you're looking at people going, well, that's a very interesting comment and it's a very interesting point you're making, but I might not listening to the point I'm making. A good example I gave the other day was I was talking about the theatres of war, and I was going, well, the USN didn't focus in the Atlantic. They were focusing on others, so realistically the RCN is more of a factor in the Atlantic. And people took that as going, that means you're saying America's not involved in Battle Atlantic. I'm going, no, the USN, the US Navy. There's actual points at which, in terms of the Battle Atlantic, the US Coast Guard are contributing more than the US Navy. Because the US Navy is focused on the Pacific, and they need everything they can get out there. And it's kind of interesting listening to the debate and going, well, yeah, this is an interesting thing sometimes I confront, especially in alternate histories, is that a case of the realities of war. No one has infinite resources. No one can be everywhere they want to be. No one can. You know? And some, history is one of those things people can get very, very quickly focused on the emotion of it and not be learning lessons of it. I'd say the lesson from World War II in that scenario is that as much resources as the Americans had, they always needed more. Same with Britain, the Royal Navy. As much resources they had, they always needed more. We're talking about the two largest navies in the world. There is at no point in World War II, no point before World War II, or even the immediate aftermath of World War II, those two were ever not in the top two, and ever not the top two. Vying for who's which, but never not the top two. And that's fun. That's an interesting bit of history, but they're still always short of stuff. And that's a lesson for us about the importance of alliances, of how you structure, how you work with allies, that you're going to have to, at certain points, sometimes bite the bullet and accept you're going to have to let your ally run that air theatre, and there's only so much you're going to be able to say. But you're still going to be learning lessons and studying it. You're still going to be learning lessons and studying it. So, yeah, it was interesting. But that being said, thank you for your support. Thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. And here's the book that's currently out. Another to join it soon. London Naval Treaty of 1930 under this scenario. So you can pretty much see what I've done. I've just gone, well, let's say instead of doing those 3 specialist submarines, they go, we're going to keep the ratios going. The ratios from the capital ships, the ratios from the heavy cruisers, roughly. Roughly, we're going to keep the ratios going. It works. So that means Britain and America are allowed 15 each. Or technically, as it's called at this point, the British Commonwealth of Nations, which covers the Empire, Britain, and the Dominions, are limited to, and this is one of the first official documents which uses Commonwealth in the international phrasings, are both allowed 15. Japan's allowed 9. And they are allowed to be up to 2,800 tons, stand displacement, and carry guns up to 6 inches. Now, you might be thinking, well, Alex, their actual full limit of submarines historically is 52,700 tons, and you just added that in, just made out the standard. Yeah, just made out the standard of the other boats, because that does fit all the other boats, the ones not exceeding 2,000 tons. Because if you do that, you could go, right, I can build 26 of these boats. It's not going to be enough submarines. That's why you end up with the T-class being about 1,000 tons, with the S-class being the weight they are, and the U-class being a couple of hundred tons, literally. These are limitations put in because you need to try and get your submarine numbers from that limitation. As I've tried to repeatedly say, the problem for the bigger navies is not the individual hull, not the hull limitations, the hull tonnage limitations. It's the cumulative limits. The cumulative numbers. Those tonnage limits, they're what really kill the bigger navies and cause them issues. Because they can't just build as much as they want when they want to build them. They are limited, they are rationed. Doesn't matter if they're all limited in size, what matters is if they're limited in quantity. You can work around the size to get quality on a budget. You can't get quantity on a budget. You can't. And so that's what they do. I reckon they'd have these other units. And that's going to cause issues straight away. Okay, that's fine for the Royal Navy. Fine for the US Navy. Fine for the Japanese Navy. None of them have got guns big enough. Immediately the French are coming into Surkoff. I think rather like Hood, she would just get included. Like she did historically. She just get added in. Yes, the French are allowed her as an exception. But now you've got a very real situation where the British and the Americans will be looking at their bigger boats and going, we can build big cruiser submarines. They can't exceed 2,800 tons in standard, but there's a lot of options there. There are a lot of options there. A lot of options. So that's bigger than a destroyer. Let's be honest. Both these are bigger than destroyers. Both these limits are bigger than destroyers. Destroyers have a theoretical ceiling, depends on the treaty, but, the destroyer leaders are limited to 1,850 tons. That's the Trouble class destroyers and their equivalents. And regular destroyers are below that. So these are big beasts of submarines that you're being promised. Big oceanic submarines, big present submarines. Okay. So if you're building these and considering the reality of building them, why? Because for the British to push for it rather than being anti-submarine, there must be a reason for it. Well, if the X-1 had worked and had delivered in the couple of critical exercises it could have taken part in something truly amazing, if it had taken out a carrier or had managed to take out a convoy single-handedly, had managed to do all interesting operations, and the other advantage with it is going to be immediately is mine-laying sub. Because if you're building a mine-laying sub and you're sticking in that tonnage rather than that tonnage, that's a lot better. Because that frees up quite a large chunk, because usually your mine-laying subs are going to be your biggest subs. And yeah, if they're part of the cruiser submarine, well, maybe one vessel instead of having 2 twin 5.25s, only has 1 twin 5.25s and uses the remaining tonnage for mines. There are options. There are ways you can go down this path. And also, that makes, to an extent, a bit of sense, combining the two roles, the cruiser submarine and the mine-laying submarine, because it allows the cruiser submarine to be even more efficient in its operations, because it can lay mines in one spot, go and cover another spot with torpedoes and guns, and therefore be in two places at once when the enemy are running through. That makes sense. The cruiser submarine is supposed to be a presence vessel. And realistically, if the British have had this, and the British are sure that everyone's going to go for these boats anyway, because of the Americans and the Italians and the Japanese pushing them and the French building them, then it makes sense to limit them, to regulate them somehow. And this regulates them. This limits them. This makes them a category. But it also leads to its own issues, because if they're now a category, they're going to be a category you're going to have to respond to. And what comes next is how you're going to develop it. To my mind, for Britain, and it's easier to work with for Britain at this point because I've got a starting point and an ending, and other boats in that area to talk about. It's realistically, you see a fusion of the work which goes into the T-class and the X-1s. I wouldn't be surprised if you get a boat which has a 10 torpedo salvo forward firing, as well as the 5.25 inch guns. I would not be surprised if you get that combined. And as said, I really wouldn't be surprised if you see something which also has a mine laying capability. Because again, do you need the 4 guns? Do you want the submarine to turn broadside on its target? If the answer is no, then do you want the twin 5.25 inch guns? Or do you want to put some 40mm AA or something aft? Some sort of submersible pom-pom unit that can provide you with cover from air attack whilst you're engaging on the surface, cruising around the world. Because that's the other thing, these boats, they cruise around the world on the surface. That range of 12,000 nautical miles, that's on the surface. So yeah, you might want to start changing things up in terms of their defences and weapon systems and start improving certain things. The development of the more hydrodynamic hull forms are going to be also have an interesting factor, because this is a vessel which is, realistically compared to the other submarines, is far more built around surface operations than subsurface operations. You know, we're talking about the period where submarines start to start the process switching over from being basically submersible torpedo boats to being something else. And in some ways, the cruiser submarine as envisioned by the X-1 is a step back. Because they're basically going, right, and we can't carry enough torpedoes, let's put a better gun on it. Let's put a better gun, let's go for a better gun. And it comes from a very conservative place, realistically, in the Navy. It comes from a very conservative place in the Admiralty thinking. But it's possible, if it's proved itself and it's been viable, yeah, they could be getting it. And if they can get a treaty allowance for it, they're going to be getting them. But what the treaty allowance is going to be used to buy is going to be an interesting thing. Because again, as I've said, the Grampus class, or Porpoise class, depending on who you're talking to, of the Royal Navy, their mine-laying submarines were a critical component. They were constructing in the 1930s, and they were the biggest submarines they were building. And they're not the only Navy doing this, because mine-laying is an effective form of submarine warfare. In fact, mine-laying is probably, if you look at it from World War I's perspective, statistically the most effective form of submarine warfare, because it's the highest risk for your opponent, whilst least risk for you, because you drop off mines and are not there when they start attacking things. you're skedaddled. So, again, when we start talking about what would a class of cruiser submarines be built after this, is that X-1 is an experimental unit. That's why she's an X-craft. She's experimental. What comes after her will be something slightly more pragmatic. Again, my opinion is probably a single twin 5.25-inch mount, 10 torpedo salvo forward, and probably some mine-laying facility aft. Because again, you could then combine that with the build that you did historically do of the Porpoise Grampus class. Those 6 boats, that tonnage doesn't need to come out of this tonnage. And that's 12,000 tons. Or roughly 12 T-boats. Roughly. 12 T-boats. Once everything's settled and done. And which would you prefer to have? Well, in this case, you can have both. You don't have to choose. You can have a class of 14, 15 vessels, which can do the kind of cruising warfare you want them to do, the kind of cruiser submarine work, and also do the massive salvo attack and the massive mine laying. And you can now use that extra 12,000 tons how you wish in the rest of your submarine fleet. It's a great force enabler. However, at this point, I have to remind you of another part of the Naval Treaty. And of course, speaking of Article 8. Yes, Article 8, Section B. And this is where the consequences are going to come in, because you have to remember there is no cumulative limit on anything down in this level. This level do not get cumulative limits. This level just get individual unit limits. And traditionally, not many powers invest not much money in this level, because they go, well, they're small ships, we can build them rapidly when war begins. But that's based on the idea of the existing submarine threat. And the existing submarine threat are judged to be capable of being dealt with by the existing vessels, which you have, the older destroyers and the older Flower-class sloops in the case of the UK. But these new cruiser submarines, they're going to be armed with up to 6-inch guns. There's nothing you've got that can deal with that, is there? Well, hang on. Okay, so Article 8, Section B, what does it read? Naval surface combat vessels exceeding 600 tons, okay, but not exceeding 2,000 tons, alright. Stand displacement, provided they have none of the following characteristics. Mount a gun above 6.1 inches, okay. Mount more than 4 guns above 3 inches, alright. Are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes, and are designed for a speed greater than 20 knots. Now, I can honestly tell you that if you look at the Royal Navy sloops, they're all not designed for a speed of greater than 20 knots. But if you look at some of their track records and histories of where they've got started off and where they end up, and you do work it out using the calculator maths, I can tell you, there is not a single design which cannot do more than 20 knots. It's just, well, they didn't design them to, they happen to turn out to be able to. We designed them with all these pressure, release valves to keep the pressure low. How were we supposed to know a chief was going to go round, tighten them up, and suddenly the pressure was going to build up to a level which allowed them to get faster? It's not what we designed it for. Look, in the nicest way. Designed or fitted to launch torpedoes. Again, you can make space on your deck for that and just not fit them. And designed of those two categories, 3 and 4, are basically, we don't want these to be destroyers by the back door. But everyone knows if you really wanted to, you could probably make them destroyers by the back door, which is one reason why I find it so surprising to me that the Japanese didn't launch. And this is probably, again, an effect of building the Yamato class and all those things. They don't have the industrial space free, the industrial capacity free, to take advantage of this. Because if there's any clause
crying out for a secret destroyer program. It's this one. It just is crying out. 2,000 tons, so to say it's as big as your large destroyers. Okay, yes, they can only mount 4 guns, but think about how many fairly good destroyer designs carry 4 or 5-inch guns, and also again, they could be only built to carry 4. And then when war comes, oh, it turns out we can fit another couple of mounts on this vessel. Oh, how illuminating. So, yeah. What you're going to see is a response to it. The old Flag-class sloops that the Royal Navy still has to go around, the old destroyers, and this is going to go for the US Navy and other navies as well. The old destroyers, they're going to look at them and go, are they suitable for this kind of warfare? Are they really what we can use? And I think the answer is going to be no. So I think you're going to see a slight ramping up of this construction. So as well as more submarines being built, you're going to get a earlier starting of the ASW building program. Now the Royal Navy was already building sloops. The Shoreham class, of which HMS Falmouth here is an example, is a good example of their 1930s design. The Shoreham class are cute, but let's consider them. They are roughly 1,000 tons. They carry 2 4-inch guns and a quad 5-inch machine gun anti-aircraft system. They can be fitted as mine layers, as minesweepers, and they can do the gunboat role in various points. But they can also be fitted with ASDIC, with depth charges as they need to be. And of course, the sloop design. Eventually, you have from the sloop design you have the Black Swan class sloops, and basically these are developed to be the tippy point of the spear for ASW warfare, the very best anti-submarine warfare vessels the British could build for World War II. And Sloop Lines develops it. The Sloop Line is also the line which is used to develop the specifications which are used to define the Flower-class corvette program and the Hunt-class escort destroyer program. And actually the Hunt-class escort destroyer program, of course, also uses the same hull design as the Black Swans, which comes from the Egret class. Bittern and Egret class, it's an interesting class. The Bitterns are the first ones to use the sloop, but realistically the Egrets are a slightly modified version which actually turns to the basis of the sloop design, of the hull form. And so it's kind of like Egrets are batch 2 Bitterns, and because the whole process of development is evolutionary. That's what the Royal Navy has going on with its development of these small ships. And they're building 3s of them, 6s of them. In this scenario, I think they'd be carrying more guns. I think they probably still go 4.7 inch. They go destroyer guns because that's the rapid firing guns they've got for hulls of this sort of size. I think they probably go slightly bigger because they'd want to give them slightly more stability as gun platforms, but also slightly more survivability. These ships don't have a lot of space for armour, and they're not... Technically, armouring them is not supposed to be done, but you have to remember subdivision can also count as a form of armouring, and we're talking about a navy, in the case of Britain, which uses water and coal as armour. There are ways they will come out to put some armour into these things which will give them some form of protection. So yeah, I think you would see a whole new generation of ASW escorts being developed, being built in numbers, before war even begins. It would be a far greater construction process before World War II even begins. It would start back in 1930, and it would probably be something like you'd match the construction of destroyers a year, so you'd be building like, I'm building 8 destroyers this year, I'll build 8 sloops. And spread them around the British Commonwealth of Nations. Because that's how you give yourself security. That's how you give yourself safety. That's how you give yourself the option to defend against these ships and these boats. And that's going to start a sort of war, I think, between the development of the cruiser submarines and the development of the escorts. And you're not just going to have to think about the escorts, you're going to have to think about the vessels they are going to be protecting, you're going to have to think about the vessels which might be surprised by these boats. Realistically, I could also see it leading to heavier dual-purpose weaponry on the aircraft carriers as well, which would probably feel that they themselves would be the number one targets for these boats, because that would make sense. Number one targets of these boats would be their primary goal, their primary aim. Because bagging a carrier is going to be a status. It is going to be a status symbol. And that's going to be something they're going to go for. Which leads us to the 1930s and the preparations for World War II, where I'm going to roughly end this video. So realistically, what happens with all this? Well, I think the first thing you're going to have to consider is, what do the Germans do? What do the Italians do? What do the French do? Not just what the British and the Americans and the Japanese do. The Germans are going to be rather late to this party, because this is going to start off, whether it wants to or not, a rapid development of ASW capabilities and vessels, and the rapid development of submarines in the early 1930s. It's going to start off some extra funding. There's going to be a surge in that area in terms of development and funding, which is going to push forward probably the Allied powers more than it's going to help Germany, which is going to have a steeper path to catch up when it starts designing things like the Type 9 here. And honestly, I can see different navies going different ways. I think for the Italians, they probably go, useful. Let's use our tonnage and order probably more like the Aetoria Ferramosca, because she's pretty much what they want. She's got 4 bow torpedoes, 4 stern torpedoes, she carries 14 torpedoes, she's got all those capabilities. They might want to build something slightly bigger than it, but realistically, she's built to be a cruiser submarine in the world of the Mediterranean. She was, as built, over-dimensioned for what she was armed with, and slower than they wished for. She only did, well, let's put it this way. She was theoretically supposed to achieve 20 knots on the surface. She never achieved more than 15. And her endurance wasn't great. But the thing is, she has a lot of potential there in the design for them to improve upon. And considering she came in at underweight by quite a significant margin, almost half that 2,800 ton limit, they might go, well, can we build something which is slightly bigger but a lot more capable? Again, is it any use for the Mediterranean? That's going to be an interesting thing. If they decide they want to still try and use it for the Mediterranean, probably not so. If they decide to use it to base in their African colonies and to work in the Indian Ocean, etc., and the North Atlantic, then it could be problematic. It could be very problematic. And it's something which they can think about. For the French, Surcouf is going to be coming. That's the obvious scenario. But what else comes? And also, what is their exact limit? Probably it's going to be some region of 6 to 7 boats in tonnage. So what do they build with that? How do they approach it? How do they, strategize for using these vessels? The Japanese, well, to be honest, I could see the Japanese ending up going down the route which leads to the I-400s a lot sooner. I could see them developing a whole class of these boats, which basically, in the moment war begins, will be operating off the Panama Canal, the American West Coast, and doing all sorts of damage there. I could see that being there, developing as a policy, because when you've got these boats and they've got the range, you might as well use them for it. And they can tie up a lot of American resources. A lot of American resources. Dealing with them. You know, and for a World War II, that would be a sensible option. For Britain and America, it's interesting. I could see possibly Congress agreeing to the Clemsons, the four stackers, being a program of turning some of them into ASW escorts, potentially, and actually ordering some destroyers earlier, maybe, hopefully earlier than 1938 Two Oceans Navy Act, but that does traditionally only have 38,000 tons of destroyer allocated in it, but whereas the 1941 has about 115 destroyers ordered in it, from memory. For Britain, I could see the sloop program, especially the presence of these boats and the idea of the French, Italians, Japanese, all these other powers getting into them, and probably the Dutch as well, looking at building a boat like it. And the thing is, these become problems. These become issues. And when I emphasize the French, you have to consider the British worry about the French was based, for a lot of this period, was they were always worried the French were going to descend into civil war. Really kind of interesting. They spent a lot of the 1930s watching the French going, are they going to go into civil war? Are they going to go into civil war? And then Spain actually happens. It actually happened. And they went, oh. And then they got even more worried about the concept of a civil war in France. So, yeah, these things are all going to build up. To the point at which I think it changes things in the beginning of World War II. Because you have to remember, historically, Germany doesn't have a lot of submarines at the beginning of World War II. They really don't. Their submarine peaks are not in 1939 and not in 1940. They are much later. They're 1941 on such a, once they've had time to build up their production base. They really don't have a lot of submarines around the beginning of World War II. If you have more escorts around and more and newer escorts around in a volume, so let's say Britain has built roughly 120 destroyers from since 1930, a bit more than that possibly, and they built roughly the same number of sloops. That's a problem. That's going to cause issues, because those vessels are going to get kills, inevitably, at the beginning of any war. And then you've got the increased number of British mine layers. All these are going to have a cumulative impact on the war and on how it goes. And that's going to realistically be the problem. I'd also think with these long-range submarines, and these long-range submarines being part of the focus, that, and I will emphasize this again, nations like America, like Britain, which depend on long-range transport of goods, which think about things in terms of where they are, their zones of safety and zones of security, are going to be far more sensitive to submarine technological development, and are going to be far more alert for its capabilities. With that being said, I'd like to hear what you think. I know normally I set the question slightly different, but realistically today, following on the policy, what do you think happens? How do you think it evolves into World War II? What do you think happens? I'd be really interested to hear your analysis and your thought process on it, because to me, there are a lot of options. There are a lot of options and how it could play out. It could shorten the war, it could lengthen the war. It could divide the war. It could mean that, well, I think if the German submarines never get off to a start, and their surface ships also suffer similar problems as they did historically, they get some successes, but they don't get enough in terms to actually be able to start causing long-term issues for the British. If the submarines, and you take out the aces and the potential aces early on, the people who've been trained pre-war, who would be training the people coming in, as well as being the people who are going to probably be the most experienced submariners, I think that could cause a lot of issues for the German war effort in terms of naval warfare. Conversely, it could mean the Italians actually are more of a problem in the Atlantic. A lot more of a problem. They were also already quite a problem with some of their long-range boats, but with these vessels, they could be really problematic. That being said, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you liked the video. And if you like, please do share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. And I think when this video comes out next week is going to be, well, Peter Dorgensvold, victor of the Battle of Dineken, and I think it's going to be Starkus Aurelius's William the Conqueror's invasion fleet. Where did it come from and where did it go? And I promise not to sing the song that immediately brings to mind. I promise not to. Thank you.